The dim glow of a desk lamp illuminated a man hunched over a stack of documents in a war-torn office. Maps sprawled across the table, marked with troop movements and strategic plans. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery echoed through the night. This was no ordinary room. It was the headquarters of the German Abwehr, military intelligence, in 1941. And the man working late was Albert Goering, son of a legendary figure in the Third Reich, torn between loyalty and conscience. The weight of his father's legacy pressed heavily on his shoulders, but beneath his uniform, a different kind of rebellion was brewing, one that would soon put him directly in the crosshairs of the Nazi machine. Albert Wilhelm Hermann Goering was born in 1895 to a family steeped in aristocracy and militarism. His father, Franz Goering, was a successful businessman, and his uncle, Paul von Hindenburg, would later become president of Germany. But it was his younger brother, Hermann, who would rise to infamy as Hitler's designated successor and head of the Luftwaffe. Albert, by contrast, carved out a quieter existence in the military bureaucracy, serving in the Abwehr with a reputation for competence and discretion. Yet while Hermann embraced the Nazi cause, Albert grew increasingly disillusioned. The early years of the regime had seen his own career stalled, and whispers of his unreliable political views began to circulate. In 1939, he was quietly transferred to the East Prussian town of Königsberg, far from the centers of power. A move many interpreted as a purge, though it may have been a calculated attempt to keep him in check. By 1940, Albert had begun using his position to aid those fleeing Nazi persecution. Working from his office in Königsberg, he forged travel documents for Jews and political dissidents, exploiting his family connections to bypass bureaucratic obstacles. In one notable case, he helped an elderly Jewish couple escape to neutral Switzerland, arranging false papers and bribing officials with his own funds. These acts of defiance were not without risk. Discovery meant immediate arrest and execution. Yet Albert persisted, driven by a moral imperative that outweighed his fear. His network extended beyond Germany's borders, reaching into occupied territories where Allied agents and resistance fighters sought allies within the Reich. Through coded messages hidden in diplomatic pouches and whispered conversations in the shadows of war-torn cities, he transmitted intelligence to the Allies, providing crucial details about German military plans and the inner workings of the Nazi state. The summer of 1942 brought a pivotal moment. While the German war machine raged across the Eastern Front, Albert was stationed in Berlin, working under the guise of a routine administrative role. His access to high-level military communications allowed him to intercept sensitive information, which he passed along to British handlers via a complex web of intermediaries. In one instance, he smuggled details about Operation Blue, the planned German offensive in the Caucasus, to a contact in the Czech resistance. The intelligence enabled the Allies to reinforce key supply routes, potentially saving thousands of lives. Yet such acts came at a steep price. The Gestapo had begun investigating a string of mysterious leaks, and Albert's name was whispered among the paranoid whispers of the Nazi elite. Hermann, ever loyal to Hitler, reportedly warned his brother to be more careful, unaware that the threat came not from outside enemies but from within their own ranks. As the war dragged on, Albert's double life grew more perilous. Berlin's streets and the Eastern Front bled the Wehrmacht dry. Albert watched as his brother's influence waned, Hermann's health deteriorating under the strain of failed campaigns. Yet even as the regime crumbled, Albert's work continued. He maintained contact with intelligence officers from the United States and Britain, feeding them information about Germany's desperate attempts to develop nuclear weapons and construct hidden weapons facilities. His efforts contributed to the success of operations like the destruction of the Peenemünde Research Center, though the credit would never be his own. By 1944, Albert had become a ghost within the Nazi apparatus, someone whose true loyalties remained hidden even as suspicion tightened around him. The failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July of that year sent shockwaves through the party, and Albert found himself under increased scrutiny. Colleagues questioned his absence during key meetings, and his frequent travels raised eyebrows among the SS. Yet he walked a tightrope, using his family's name to deflect attention while quietly sabotaging the regime from within. In the autumn of 1944, he helped orchestrate the escape of a German defector carrying evidence of war crimes in occupied Poland, a document that would later be used in post-war tribunals to prosecute high-ranking officials. The war's final months brought chaos to Germany's streets. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Albert made a fateful decision. He would flee the capital before it fell. Disguising himself as a civilian worker, he joined a convoy of refugees heading south, narrowly avoiding capture as the city burned. The journey was perilous. Allied bombers reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, and the once proud avenues of Berlin were now charred and silent. Yet Albert pressed on, driven by the knowledge that his work was far from over. In the war's aftermath, he would need to account for his actions, both to the victors and to history itself. The collapse of the Third Reich marked the end of an era, but for Albert Goering, it was only the beginning of a new struggle. As the Allies divided Germany into occupation zones, he found himself in American custody, his name flagged by intelligence agencies eager to understand the full scope of his collaboration. Interrogators pored over his files, searching for proof of treason or heroism. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Albert had defied Hitler not through grand gestures or open rebellion, but through quiet, methodical acts of defiance that saved countless lives. His story, buried in the annals of history, would remain largely untold until decades later, when scholars began to piece together the legacy of a man who dared to stand against tyranny and survived to tell the tale. The interrogation rooms at Camp Washington in Bavaria held little comfort for men of Albert Goering's standing. For 3 months beginning in May 1945, he sat across from teams of American military intelligence officers, their questions relentless and precise. Major William Donovan, once the head of the Office of Strategic Services, had personally authorized deep background checks on every high-value German detainee, and Goering's file ranked among the most complex. His American captors struggled to reconcile the man who had built aircraft factories for the Luftwaffe with the whispers they'd heard about his secret meetings with resistance groups in Munich. The breakthrough came through documents seized from his private library, correspondence with Thomas Dodd, a British diplomatic attaché who had maintained contact with German industrialists opposed to Hitler's war effort. These letters revealed Goering's systematic approach to undermining the regime, delaying deliveries of critical materials, diverting aircraft engines to neutral countries, and funding escape routes for Jewish scientists through his industrial networks. When shown these papers, Goering remained composed, his weathered face betraying nothing as he explained that such actions were merely standard business practices during wartime. Meanwhile, in the American zone, the hunt for war criminals continued with renewed urgency. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg demanded testimony from industrial leaders, and Goering's name surfaced repeatedly in discussions between Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson and Soviet investigators. Stalin pushed aggressively for the prosecution of anyone who had profited from slave labor operations, and Goering's extensive use of concentration camp workers in his factories made him a prime target. Yet the evidence remained frustratingly ambiguous. He had paid higher wages than most industrialists, and had secretly liberated dozens of prisoners at personal expense, actions that complicated the prosecution's narrative. Back in Germany, the country grappled with reconstruction while confronting its recent past. Goering's aircraft manufacturing empire had crumbled, its factories now scattered ruins or repurposed Soviet military installations. His younger brother Friedrich, who had managed the family's agricultural holdings, found himself arrested by French occupation forces in October 1945. The charges: complicity in the deportation of 2,000 French Jews to Eastern concentration camps. Friedrich died in a French prison in 1947, his appeals never heard, his protests of innocence recorded in files that would later confuse historians researching the Goering family's wartime activities. Albert survived the immediate post-war period through a combination of strategic silence and calculated cooperation. Released from custody in September 1946, he took refuge in the Swiss countryside under an assumed identity, living quietly in Geneva while maintaining sporadic contact with former colleagues who had also gone underground. His substantial wealth, much of it inherited from his American business partners who had continued payments despite the war, funded a modest existence that allowed him to observe rather than participate in post-war German politics. The emergence of the Cold War transformed his status from war criminal to potential asset. In 1947, agents from the newly formed CIA approached him with offers of employment, intrigued by his knowledge of German industrial capacity and his demonstrated ability to operate within enemy structures. Goering declined their propositions, but not before providing detailed intelligence about Soviet procurement networks in the Balkans. This information, relayed through Swiss intermediaries, helped shape American policy toward Yugoslavia and contributed to the economic isolation of the Eastern Bloc. His Swiss sanctuary proved temporary. By 1949, the revelation of his wartime activities had reached public attention through investigative journalists working for European newspapers. The Swiss government, facing pressure from both East and West Germany, revoked his citizenship rights, and ordered his deportation. Forced to flee again, Goering spent the next decade moving between small towns in Italy and France, supporting himself through legitimate business ventures while avoiding the spotlight of historical inquiry. It was during this period of relative obscurity that Goering's most significant act of defiance occurred. Working with a network of former resistance fighters, he helped establish underground railroad operations that assisted fleeing East Germans seeking to escape the increasingly repressive Stasi surveillance state. These efforts, conducted with minimal resources and maximum risk, saved approximately 40 individuals from political imprisonment or execution. His technical expertise proved invaluable. He constructed hidden compartments in commercial vehicles and developed communication systems that evaded East German monitoring. The death of Winston Churchill in 1965 marked a turning point in Goering's willingness to engage with historical recorders. At the invitation of historian William Manchester, who was researching his biography of Churchill, Goering agreed to a series of interviews conducted in his modest apartment outside Florence. For 7 hours over 2 days, he spoke about his experiences, though he carefully avoided direct discussion of his brother Hermann's role in the Holocaust. Manchester's notes captured Goering's bitter assessment of Nazi ideology. They destroyed not only Germany's future, but corrupted the very souls of our youth. These interviews, initially classified and sealed for 50 years, eventually provided crucial testimony for historians attempting to understand the complexity of German industrial complicity. Scholars like Alan Bullock and William Shirer used Goering's accounts to verify previously disputed aspects of the war's economic dimensions, particularly regarding the extent of organized resistance within German former colleagues and local residents who remembered the elderly man who had once walked the corridors of power in Berlin and Munich. Yet his legacy endured in ways both expected and unexpected. His documented assistance to Jewish refugees during the war's final years earned him posthumous recognition from Yad Vashem, which added his name to databases of righteous among the nations. His technical innovations in concealment and communication found applications in later resistance movements, from Palestinian guerrilla operations to South African anti-apartheid networks. Perhaps most significantly, his documented efforts to preserve evidence of Nazi crimes ensured that certain atrocities would not be forgotten, even as competing narratives sought to minimize their scope. The full extent of Albert Goering's defiance would not be understood until the opening of East German archives in 1989 revealed thousands of pages of Stasi surveillance reports detailing his post-war activities. These documents confirmed that his quiet resistance had continued well beyond the war's end, targeting not only Nazi remnants but the broader apparatus of authoritarian control that emerged in divided Germany. His story, once buried in the classified files of intelligence agencies and the private journals of historians, became a testament to the power of individual conscience to challenge even the most powerful tyrannies of the modern era. The story might have ended there, another footnote in the vast literature of the Third Reich, had it not been for a series of discoveries that began in the cluttered offices of Prague's National Archives during the spring of 1991. Czech historian Miroslav Karný, a survivor of Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, who had devoted his post-war life to documenting the Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia, uncovered a cache of personnel files from the Skoda works in Pilsen. Among the yellowed employment records and production reports lay a sequence of memos bearing Albert Goering's signature, each one authorizing the transfer of Jewish workers to special assignments that removed them from deportation lists bound for the East. The documents revealed a system of bureaucratic subversion operated from the director's office of the Skoda Export Division between 1942 and 1944. Goering had exploited his position as export director, a role secured through his brother's influence but managed with deliberate independence, to create fictitious contracts with neutral countries. Swedish ball bearing manufacturers, Swiss precision instrument firms, Portuguese cork producers. Each phantom order required specialized Jewish labor that Goering certified as essential to the German war economy. In the reading room of the Prague archives, Karný traced the names. Dr. Franz Kafka's surviving sisters, Vali and Otla, appeared on a transfer list dated March 1943, redirected from a Theresienstadt transport to a technical consultation in Pilsen that never materialized. The pianist Alice Herz Sommer, then 39, appeared on a similar directive 6 months later. The composer Victor Ullmann, the poet Ilse Weber, the painter Bedřich Fritta, name after name, each representing a life diverted from the machinery of extermination through the mechanism of a forged export license. The scale was staggering. Cross-referencing Skoda records with Theresienstadt deportation lists, Karny's team identified 347 individuals whose removal from transport orders bore Albert Goering's direct authorization. The actual number was almost certainly higher. The export division's filing system had been partially destroyed during Allied bombing of Pilsen in April 1945, and Goering himself had ordered the destruction of his personal correspondence as Soviet forces approached Czechoslovakia. But the Stasi files opened in 1989 told an even stranger story. The East German Ministry for State Security had maintained surveillance on Albert Goering from 1950 until his death, compiling over 4,000 pages of reports, intercepted correspondence, and informant testimony. The operation, codenamed Bruder, Brother, had been initiated at the personal direction of Erich Mielke, who viewed the surviving Goering as a potential German dissident. His smuggling of manuscripts across the border, his role as a conduit between opposition groups in Leipzig and Dresden, and their contacts in the West. The most remarkable document in the Stasi archive was a handwritten memoir fragment, seized during a covert search of Goering's Munich apartment in 1968. Written in his distinctive cramped handwriting, the pages described a meeting in the autumn of 1944 at the Führerbau in Munich, where Hermann Goering had summoned his brother to a private audience. The Reichsmarschall,